Today we are pleased to introduce and host local author Bob Jacobson as part of the Wisconsin Historical Museum's History Sandwiched In lecture series and Les Paul's contribution to Wisconsin innovation. Wisconsin Innovations is made possible by a lead grant from the Madison Community Foundation, generous gifts from American Family Insurance, the UView Foundation, and Century Equipment Corporation, along with additional support from Ann L. Koski, Promega Corporation, Madison Gas and Electric Foundation, U.S. Bank, and Wisconsin Public Radio. The opinions expressed today are those of the presenters and are not necessarily those of the Wisconsin Historical Society or the museum's employees. Please join me in welcoming Bob to the stage as he describes the many obstacles and inspirations that inspired Les Paul's career.
Thanks. No, this is not a concert, and I'm not a real guitar player. My name is Bob Jacobson, and I'm not a guitar player. I'm a writer, and I had the privilege of writing this little book about Les Paul. It's a little book for young readers, and I'm guessing a lot of you already know who Les Paul was, but when I was a teenager, I didn't know who Les Paul was. I would walk into music stores when I started getting interested in guitars and such, and I'd see something that looked a little like this hanging on the wall, and I'd say, oh, Les Paul, I don't care, who's he? I just thought he was some guy who owned a guitar company. Now, what you see here is not one of the really nice old Les Paul guitars that goes for thousands and thousands of dollars on eBay. This is kind of a lower end, but authentic Gibson American-made Les Paul guitar. This one's about 12 years old or so. But what I didn't know at the time is that Les Paul was, at that time, and continues to be, although he's no longer alive, arguably the most important contributor to popular music as we know it today. He contributed in so many ways. He was not only one of the greatest guitar players ever, but he was a very important inventor, and he invented two things that the music industry would be completely different without. He invented the solid body electric guitar, and in my opinion, even more importantly, he invented multi-track recording. Before Les Paul started inventing stuff, you had to get the whole band in one room and get them to all play the song right the whole way through, and hope that the levels were right and everything worked out just perfect. And now, as you probably know, the way a lot of people record songs is they just piece it together, you know, do one track, maybe even punch in a little bit where they made a little gaffe here or there, and they piece it all together. That wasn't possible without multi-track recording. So, who was Les Paul? Well, he was born in Waukesha, Wisconsin, right down the road towards Milwaukee, on June 9th, 1915, which happens to have been one day after my negative 43rd birthday, which means he was basically, he lived about twice as long as I have lived so far. So he lived a good long time. He was a very curious kid, and he liked to take stuff apart from a very early age. And one of the kind of recurring themes throughout the early part of his life is that his mother was always very, very supportive of everything he wanted to try. His father left the family when Les was very young, so he and his brother Ralph were raised by their mother Evelyn. And he would do things like take apart her player piano to see how it worked. And really that was kind of a life-forming thing, because when you think about it, a player piano was an early form of analog recording. And those were the kind of things that gave him his early ideas about reproducing sound. He liked to take apart her phonograph to see how that worked. How do you have this round thing and you stick this needle on it and this beautiful music comes out of this horn on the end? He was really curious about that kind of stuff. And amazingly, his mother let him and even encouraged him to take these things apart to see how they worked, as long as he knew how to put them back together, which fortunately he did. Les was also very interested in music from a very, very early age. He loved to listen to music. Radio was in its very early stages when he was a kid, and he very quickly had some favorites. One guy he really loved to listen to on the radio was a guy named Pie Plant Pete, who would play hokey songs on the guitar and on the harmonica. And he was one of Les's early role models when he started playing music himself. And Les got his first harmonica at age 10, and he got his first guitar at age 12, and he just took to them very quickly. He got competent at them very quickly. And before too long, he got good enough to start playing at local restaurants and socials and things like that. He started playing semi-professionally at age 13. They would hire him to play at movie theaters before shows and things like that. And his mother made him a cute sailor suit, which there's a picture of in the book, which I won't flip through now and find the page. But that's how Pie Plant Pete dressed up for his performances. So Les had his mother make him a sailor suit so he would look like Pie Plant Pete. Another musician that was very influential on him early on was a guy named Sonny Joe Wolverton, who was the guitar player for a band called Rube Tronson and his Texas Cowboys. And they would come through town and play in Waukesha, and one day Les got to talking to Sonny Joe, and Sonny Joe asked him if he played the guitar, and Les was like, yeah, a little bit. And so Sonny Joe showed him a few licks, and then they would pass through town pretty regularly, and every time Les would show him what he had worked on in between, and Sonny Joe would show him some more stuff, and that was kind of one of his early mentor and teachers. He started getting so good that by the time he was 15, Sonny Joe gave him a call and said, how'd you like to go on tour with Rube Tronson? He's 15 years old. So he asks his mother, and this is another example of how Evelyn was very supportive of Les in all of his musical and tinkering endeavors. She said, okay, you can go as long as you promise me that you're going to come back at the end of the summer and go back to school. So at age 15, Les takes off with these professional musicians and goes on tour for the summer and learns the hard-boiled ways of the traveling professional musician. He got paid $10 a night, which may not sound like much now, but that was a lot of money back then. We're talking, you know, late 1920s, 1930-ish. And that was a lot of money for a young kid to have in his pocket, so he had some spending money available to him. So he came back, went back to school, and another year later, year passes, and he gets another call from Sonny Joe Wolverton. Says, hey Les, I'm in St. Louis, I've got this radio show, why don't you move to St. Louis and do this radio show with me, we'll put together this act. So he's 17 now. He asks his mother, Mom, can I move to St. Louis and be a professional musician? And this time, you know, she knew he wasn't coming back. There was no more going back to school this time, but she not only gave him her blessing, but she took the Greyhound bus down to St. Louis with him and said, Sonny Joe, take care of my boy. And that was the beginning of his full-time professional musician career. And Sonny Joe and Les put together this goofy hillbilly act called the Ozark Apple Knockers. Don't ask me. And they had a very popular radio show in St. Louis for a while, and then it got canceled there, and they moved it around. They started playing on radio in Springfield, Missouri, and then eventually they ended up in Chicago. So they moved on to a much bigger market, and it was very popular there. Once Les was in Chicago, he got bitten by the jazz bug. Jazz was the happening thing, and there were a lot of world-class players in Chicago, and so Les would go do his hokey hillbilly radio show with Sonny Joe as an apple knocker, and then at night he would be hitting the jazz clubs and jamming with some of Chicago's finest. And by this time his playing skills had really started to evolve. He had learned how to be a good jazz improviser, so he wasn't just strumming on those little two-chord hillbilly things anymore. He was becoming a real musician. And he started getting gigs, backing up popular singers. And What I didn't mention is that I'm not just going to talk for 45 minutes. I brought a bunch of tunes, and I'm going to inflict some listening on you. This isn't going to make for great TV viewing. I didn't think to choreograph any moves to go along with them. But anybody who wants to dance can come on up. But the first professional recording that Les made was as a backup player to a singer named Georgia White. At some point, Les realizes that, okay, if I'm going to be a jazz dude, Chicago's fine and good, but New York is really the place to be. And by then he had put together a very good trio consisting of himself, a bass player named Ernie Newton, and a singer named Jimmy Atkins. Now that name is going to come up again in a very significant way later. Remember that name, Atkins. So they had been gigging around Chicago for a while, and Les finally says to them, hey, we really ought to go to New York. And they're like, I don't know, I don't want to go to New York. So Les basically told them a complete bold-faced lie to get them to move to New York with him. He told them that he was buddies with the famous band leader, Paul Whiteman, one of the biggest big band leaders of the age. He says, oh yeah, we'll go to New York. I'll call my buddy Paul, and he's going to get us on the big time right away. So like, okay, that sounds pretty good. Along the way, Les stopped off at the Justice of the Peace to marry his girlfriend, Virginia. And they go off to New York. And the days are going by, and Ernie and Jimmy are starting to say, okay, when do we get to meet Paul? And Les just keeps stalling, and finally can't really put it off anymore. So he figures, okay, we're just going to have to bluff our way through this. So he takes his bandmates to the building where Paul Whiteman's office was. And they're standing around with their instruments, and they wait for Paul to come in. And Les is like, hey, Paul, it's me, Les. You know, I skipped a really important detail at the very beginning. Les Paul's name was not always Les Paul. He was born Lester Polsfuss. He became Les Paul when he got into jazz. When he first started performing early on, he went by Red Hot Red because he had red hair and his childhood nickname was Red. And he didn't start being Les Paul until his Chicago days. So now he's Les Paul. Okay, now we can fast forward back to where we were in the story. Pick up where we left off. So Paul Whiteman looks at him like he's crazy and ignores him and walks on. And Jimmy and Ernie kind of figured out what was going on at this point, and they're about to get really mad. And then an amazing thing happened, and it's kind of exemplary of a whole lot of amazing bluffs that Les managed to pull off throughout his life to get where he got. Another famous band leader happens to walk in, whose office was also in the building, a guy named Fred Waring, who had a very well-known big band called Fred Waring and the Pennsylvanians. Now, Fred Waring was also famous for another thing. Anybody know what else the Waring name is associated with? Ever heard of the Waring blender? Waring small appliances? Same guy, Fred Waring. He didn't invent the blender, but he bankrolled that early company that made the Waring blender. Yeah, the world was a lot smaller back then. So Fred Waring comes up, and Les says, quick, start playing. So they start playing a tune. Well, Fred Waring's waiting for the elevator, and at first Fred just ignores them, as you'd expect, and then he starts realizing, hey, these guys are kind of good. So he lets them into the elevator with him, says, keep playing. By the time they got to Fred's floor, he had signed up the Les Paul Trio to join the Pennsylvanians. And so they got a regular gig on Fred Waring's radio show. They would play in the band, and then they'd have a little feature where they'd come in and do a show just as the Les Paul Trio with Jimmy Atkins singing. Now, if our audio was working, I would play you a cut that I really love from one of those radio shows. It's called Lazy River, but I don't think our tech is working yet. Is it? Nope? Okay. But what that cut really shows is that Jimmy Atkins was a darn good singer. He never really became a big star in his own right, but he could have. He was a really good singer. So they're muddling along, playing with the Pennsylvanians. Everything's going good. Jess had the opportunity to go to the jazz clubs and play with all of New York's hottest jazz players, doing basically what he wanted to do. This was about 1940, and the other thing that started happening around this time is from a very early age, Les had got this idea, even from when he was a kid playing in parking lots, that, you know, guitars are great, but you can't really hear them from very far away. And so he rigged up a way to amplify a guitar. One of the first ways he did it was by jamming the needle from his mother's record player into the bridge of his guitar and then hooking that up to the speaker from her radio. So he basically taken apart everything in the house and using the pieces to make his first electric guitar. It didn't sound very good, but you could hear it, and he could be playing in a parking lot, and the people on the other side of the parking lot could actually hear it. And as time went on, he started experimenting with other materials to use to make it work better. And you could really say that the next 30 years represented his attempts to improve on his first attempts to make an electric guitar. Now, by the time he was playing with Fred Waring, he was playing electric guitars a goodly amount of the time. And he had a big breakthrough in about 1941 with a version that he called the Log. That's pretty famous. And you can see the Log, or versions of the Log, if you go to the Discovery World exhibit about Les Paul, or if you go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, there are logs around that you can actually look at. And the Log was kind of a freak. And he built it working with a company called Epiphone, which is now owned by Gibson, which is a company that eventually went on to manufacture Les Paul guitars. But he took the Log to Gibson and says, hey, you should manufacture this. And they took one look at this monstrosity and like, nobody's going to buy this. Because basically it didn't really look like a guitar. It was called the Log because it was basically a slab of wood, which is why it's called a solid body guitar with the electronics hooked up. And then he put on the curvy parts just kind of as an afterthought so it would look a little less otherworldly so you could actually call it a guitar. But they didn't really do anything. But Gibson didn't want anything to do with it in 1941. They said, forget it, we're not making these things. So along the way, Les started getting these ideas in his head about, you know, New York's fine, but what I really want to do is go to Hollywood. I want to work with people like Bing Crosby. I want to be in movies. Around that time, he also had a terrible accident while he was fiddling with one of his early amplifiers, and he got a really bad electric shock and burnt his hands really bad, and he couldn't play for a few months. And during that time, this idea of going to Los Angeles had really kind of sank in, and he decided that's what I'm going to do. So he parted ways, once his hands healed up, he parted ways with Jimmy and Ernie and went off to Hollywood. And by then, a lot of people knew who he was. He had been on the radio a lot, and so he had no trouble landing a job pretty much right away as a studio musician with NBC Radio. And this was in 1943. And shortly after that, he got drafted into the Army. And his life didn't actually change much. His Army life consisted of basically playing the guitar and backing up people at USO shows. And he got to work with people like the Andrews Sisters and Meredith Willson, who was a big Army band leader, but many of you might remember as the person who wrote the famous musical Music Man. And I believe may have even played in John Philip Sousa's band, although don't quote me on that one. I didn't write his biography. So he gets out of the Army, goes back to working as a studio musician, and around this time he just gets very, very, I won't use the word obsessed, but he's just like, Bing Crosby, he's the guy, gotta work with Bing Crosby. So he used sort of the same tactic that he had used to hook up with Fred Waring, to hook up with Bing Crosby. He knew that Bing liked to collect his thoughts before his own radio show by going into this one empty studio. So Les sort of ambushed him. He was waiting in that studio for Bing when he showed up. And as soon as Bing walks in, Les starts jamming away, putting out his best stuff. And of course, Bing loved him, because everybody loved him. And Bing immediately hired him to play backup on his radio show. And they started being frequent collaborators. In 1945, they recorded a song together called It's Been a Long, Long Time. And that became a pretty big hit. And the cool thing about that song is that you know, Bing Crosby was a lot more famous than Les Paul at that time, and yet when you listen to that song, it's obvious that they are equal partners in it. This is not Les Paul backing up Bing Crosby. This is two great musicians collaborating on a song together, and they really do share the spotlight in it. Meanwhile, Les was becoming in great demand as a backup musician. He put together a new trio. They went on tour with the Andrews Sisters. And he would also play backup guitar on Andrew's sister's recordings. There was one song I really like that maybe we're going to get to hear. Are you working on it? All right. Let me know when you're ready. But one of the things that also happened around this time is that Les was spending a lot of time fiddling around with recording equipment. As he was involved in more and more recording sessions as a backup musician, he could see that he knew a lot more about recording techniques than a lot of the professional studio engineers knew. He'd simply spent more time fiddling with stuff than they had. And he had come to understand things about microphone placement, how the electronics work. And so he decided to put together his own studio in his garage. And so he started acquiring pieces of equipment. And eventually people started coming to him to record their albums. And he, over the next few years, came up with a lot of breakthroughs that really changed the way music was recorded. He was the first guy to figure out how to do some echo and delay kinds of effects. He pioneered certain close miking techniques, and you can really hear this when he started working a few years later with Mary Ford, the way she was able to just sing very quietly and yet have it still come out powerfully. That was sort of a new innovation that a lot of people hadn't figured out yet. And along about this time, he received a gift from his pal Bing. Bing gave him a top-of-the-line, high-end Ampex 300 reel-to-reel tape recorder. That was the top of the line at that time, so Les was playing around with that a lot. And one of the things that he figured out you could do is, if you had two recording machines, you could use them to record multiple tracks on the same recording. And initially, you had to do it with what's called ping-pong recording, and that's basically exactly what it sounds like. You record one part on one recording machine, then you play that back and play along with it on another instrument or voice, and record both of those parts on a second machine. And then you can do that going back and forth as many times as you can without the sound quality degrading too much. And people actually continued using that method for decades after. I think the Beatles even did some of that on some of their recordings. But a couple years later, he had a really, really, really big breakthrough. And that was when he figured out that he could stick another recording head onto his Ampex 300. And that way, he could record two tracks on the same machine without having to ping it or pong it, whichever it is. I don't know the technically correct term for which direction that went in. And then as time went on, he took that further until by the mid-50s, he had figured out how to record 8 tracks on a single machine. And that really changed recording forever, and that became the standard for years to come. Are we good to go? Oh boy, how far back do we want to go? Well, we'll just keep going where we're going. So around 1947, he started really putting this stuff into play, and he created what was called the new sound. And I want to play a cut that became a hit in 1948. That was the first thing that he recorded using the new sound. It's a song called Lover. And I couldn't believe it when I first heard this. It sounded like outer space music, and I can't believe people actually wanted to hear this. I mean, it's great, but people should not have been ready for this at the time, and yet it did become a hit. I think it sounds like crazy space music. Can you cue up Lover? The first time I heard this, I had to check and see if it was playing at the right speed. But it was an iPod, so I guess it had to be. Can you hear that okay back there? Just want to play it long enough till it comes to the really freaky part. There's this abrupt shift. It'll be another minute, so I hope you're liking it, because we gotta wait. It's kind of unfortunate that we didn't listen to some of the earlier songs so you can really hear what a departure this is from what he had been playing before this. Okay, that's probably enough of that. Leave some time for questions. So then a terrible thing happened. Right before this got released, Les Paul, who had by then met a young singer named Colleen Summers, who he was auditioning for a new radio show he was trying to put together, and who had then changed her name to Mary Ford, because I guess Colleen Summers wasn't popular sounding enough. I never understood that one. But anyway, Mary Ford, who he went on to marry. They were visiting Les's mother in 1948 in Waukesha, and on the way back, they hit a storm and drove off a bridge, and Les got horribly injured. His right arm, his right elbow got crushed, and initially they thought he might lose the arm, and he begged the doctor to set it in such a way that his right hand was right there over his belly button where he could still pick his guitar, which they did. And there's some pictures. There's one in the book that I don't know the page number offhand, but shows him in like with 3/4 of his body in a cast, but he rigged up a special guitar stand so he could still play even while he was all casted up. Meanwhile, while he was barely able to play, Lover came out and he became a big hit. He and Mary Ford became collaborators, and they had a radio show together. And they started, within the next couple of years, they started churning out hit after hit. And this was kind of the biggest, the most popular success that Les ever enjoyed throughout his career as a musician came during those next few years. They had a #1 hit in 1951. Called How High the Moon, which sounds a little like this. This is one you're probably familiar with. Now at this time it was still very unusual for a singer to be singing harmony with herself on a recording. So you hear a couple of Mary Ford on here. That was really still very unusual. It was much more common to hear things like the Andrews Sisters with 3 sisters who had to sing their parts right at the same time. That's probably enough of that. Oh, okay. If you guys would rather hear that than hear me talk, my feelings won't be hurt. Another big thing happened in the early 50s. A year after this song was a big hit, 1952, Les had been tinkering with his electric guitars all along, and it became clear by then that other people were going to come up with solid body electric guitars very soon. Leo Fender, I'm sure you've heard of Fender guitars, and a guy named Adolf Rickenbacker. No, that was not a German flying ace from World War I. He was another guitar maker, and his guitars are also very famous. Les goes to the Gibson people and says, hey, look, I've asked you this before. If you don't do this now, these other guys are going to get there first. Start manufacturing my guitar. So the Gibson Guitar Company finally started manufacturing Les Paul guitars in 1952, solid body electric guitars, and they were pretty popular, and so that was a big deal. And then in 1953, Les and Mary got their own TV show. They were on top of the world. They had another huge, huge hit. Their biggest hit ever came out in 1953, Vaya con Dios. You guys remember this one?
Now the time has come to part, the time for
How about if instead of cutting the song off, I'll just start talking over it? Then we're all happy. This was the peak of the popularity of Les Paul and Mary Ford as a performing duo. They were top of the charts, touring all over the place to huge audiences, and they had a smash hit, well, hit TV show, and which they would record in their own studio, which was, again, the advantage of having a guy who knew how to do the technical stuff on his own, so they didn't have to rely on all these whiny engineers who wanted to tell you what to do all the time. But as the 50s went on, their popularity started to kind of wane. By the early 60s, Mary was getting tired of performing. That kind of put a strain on their marriage. And in 1964, they divorced. In 1965, Les retired from active performing, in part because by then his hearing was starting to go, he was also starting to struggle with arthritis. He was frustrated because he could not play the way he was accustomed to. I mean, the way he was playing when he was in his 20s and 30s was super fast. He was the fastest dude around, and he couldn't really do that anymore, and he was frustrated. So he figured he would stop being a performer and focus on his inventions. And he continued to have breakthroughs and improvements on the electronics, all related to sound, that he had pioneered. One interesting thing that he got involved in is, as his hearing started to deteriorate, he started being interested in finding a way to improve the hearing aid. It was kind of right in his wheelhouse. It addressed an immediate personal need, and who knew more about amplification technology than Les Paul? So he spent a lot of time over the next couple decades making improvements on the hearing aid. But he was kind of out of the public eye. He didn't play much between 1965 and about 1972. Then in 1972, he got a call from an old friend and asked him if he wanted to do a little club gig. And Les was kind of bored, and he said, sure, why not? And he was living in New York at this time, and so he started doing the occasional small club gig, and people liked it. And so in 1975, he was asked to do a big concert at Carnegie Hall. And that was his real return to the limelight. And by then, he was an elder statesman, more of the living legend kind of guy. And it was a huge hit. And so the following year, he got a call from an old buddy of his, another famous guitarist. Anyone know who that's going to be? Chet Atkins. Kid brother of his old bandmate, Jimmy Atkins. And Chet says, hey Les, let's make a record of some of these old tunes together. So they made a record. It was called Chester and Lester. And it was a huge smash hit, won a bunch of Grammy Awards. And that put Les back into the limelight. And here's a cut from that album. This song has been recorded by many, many, many people over the years. Anyone know the name of this song? Caravan. This is my favorite version of Caravan of all that have been ever recorded. So by this time, Les really had achieved living legend status, and the awards started coming in droves. He got a Lifetime Achievement Grammy in 1983. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1988. Along the way, he decided, what I really like to do is perform. And he couldn't play the way he used to, but he had figured out what a lot of us geezers figure out eventually, is that it's not all about the technical wizardry, and if you got the music inside of you, you can get more mileage out of one perfect note than you can with every fast flurry in the book. So he started playing a regular gig every week at a club in New York called Fat Tuesdays in 1984. And he did that for about 12 years. And 1984, he was approaching, let's see, how old would he have been then? 15, yeah, about 70 years old. Who knew that he had another good 20 some years left in him at that point. But he kept doing that weekly gig until Fat Tuesdays closed in 1996. So he moved that jam session over to a club called Iridium, and he kept doing that until pretty close to when he died. And famous musicians would show up and sit in with them, and it was a very jolly scene, and he would just be one of the guys jamming with these young rockers who were just delighted to have a chance to play with this legend, Les Paul. So 2005 was another big year. He was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame, the Songwriters Hall of Fame, National Inventors Hall of Fame, and he released his first new album in nearly 30 years. It's called Les Paul and Friends, which won 2 Grammys. And then I want to play you a cut from that because that was an all-star album. He had like people from every walk of the musical world sit in on that album. And this song I just love. It's called 69 Freedom Special. And you have never heard a 90-year-old white guy be this funky in your life. Cool.
What year was this?
That was 2005 that album came out. In a couple years later, 2007, he came to Waukesha to do a big concert to raise money for an exhibit that they are trying to still open in Waukesha. And 2008, Discovery World opened their big Les Paul exhibit. He came and did a concert for that. And then a year later, he died in 2009, August 12th, 2009, at age 94, and is buried in Waukesha. And nowadays, people are more familiar with the name Les Paul. When they walk into a guitar store and see that name on those guitars hanging on the wall, most people know he's not like Jay Tercer or whoever Ibanez is or any of those other guys. He was the guy who made it all happen with solid body electric guitars and recording the way people still record today.